In my last video, I compared the R6 to the original EOS R when it comes to filmmaking. And spoiler alert, I chose the EOS R6 in basically everything and it completely crushed the original R. And in my opinion, you should invest the $700 more when your focus is on filmmaking. And in this video, I want to do the same thing for photography. And I think it's a lot closer here and it really depends on what you do, and it's not as day and night as it is with filmmaking. My name is Amy Cooper and welcome to Megapixels. I've been shooting a lot on the original EOS R, portrait photography, landscape, as well as sports photography. We then upgraded to the EOS R5 and the EOS R6. I don't own the R6, but Bell does. And you probably know Bell if you're a subscriber to this channel. And if you're not, then here's your chance. And she is using this camera alongside her R5 for photography a lot. She mainly does sports photography, but she also does some portrait photography, so she has a big arsenal of experience with both of these cameras. Let's start our comparison with the biggest elephant in the room, because I think this is the one thing that people are most worried about when choosing the R6 is the megapixel count. The original R has 30 megapixels, whereas the R6 only has 20 megapixels. And a lot of people are afraid that this just isn't enough to crop in or to print big. And my opinion on the matter is that it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Yes, you have 10 megapixels more on the R, so technically you do have a bit sharper images and you can crop in more. But in a real world scenario, I found 20 megapixels way enough for most of the stuff that I shot. As a matter of fact, I have a lot of my pictures printed on canvases and they're hanging here in my apartment. And those are pretty big canvases at times. And I shot most of them on the original Canon 1D3. And this is a 10 megapixel camera. And I also shot for big clients and they printed my pictures on billboards. Yes, billboards coming out of a 10 megapixel camera, and no one ever complained. So now you have twice the resolution on the R6, and I think for prints, this is just sufficient. There's obviously an exception here. So if you find yourself cropping in on almost all of your images because you're shooting wildlife, you're shooting birds photography or sports photography, and your telelenses aren't long enough, then the 10 megapixels do give you a benefit of being able to crop in and still remain a little bit more of the resolution. So here I would probably choose the R over the R6 for the megapixels alone, but it does come with a caveat, and that brings us to our next category, and that is the autofocus. If you're shooting a lot of fast-paced content, birds and sports, then the R6 has a big advantage over the EOS R because it has a much better autofocus. The original R has a dual pixel autofocus with around 5600 autofocusing fields, whereas the R6 has a dual pixel autofocus too with almost twice as many autofocusing fields. It also has a deep learning algorithm that makes it a lot stickier when it comes to faces. And I can attest to that. We used the R6 for sports a lot, and that camera is really sticky on fast moving subjects that go in and out, so the tracking on this camera is absolutely amazing and the best that I have ever used on any camera alongside the EOS R5. So if you find yourself shooting fast-paced content a lot, then definitely go with the R6 and forfeit the 10 megapixels over the R because the autofocus is much better in that department. Now let's talk a little bit about low-light shooting, because if you do shoot sports, you oftentimes find yourself in a venue that isn't lit properly and you need to raise the ISO. Same is true for weddings, for example. I don't think that the original R is a bad camera when it comes to low-light situations, but it isn't a great camera either, whereas the R6 can definitely hold its own. It's still no Sony a7S III, but I shot on this camera in ISO 25600 and I had no problems of using these images with a little bit of noise reduction in post. Another big advantage when shooting fast-paced content is the frames per second, and here the R6 shines yet again, because the original R only shoots 8 frames per second, whereas the R6 shoots 12 frames per second at mechanical shutter and up to 20 frames per second at electronical shutter. And 20 frames over 8 frames per second make a huge difference when it comes to fast-paced sports photography, or I assume bird photography and wildlife as well. Now pair these 20 frames per second with the great tracking autofocus, you have the perfect sports photography camera. And if I was a sports photographer only or mainly, I would hands down choose the R6 over the EOS R, no doubt. And to give you another indicator here, that most dedicated sports photography cameras like the 1DX Mark III and the EOS R that are used to shooting the highest and biggest sports events in history only have 20 megapixels. And these cameras need to crop in all these situations a lot, but again, I don't think the megapixel count is that big of a deal. Another key difference between the two cameras is the card slots. The R6 has 2, the original R only has 1. And whereas this isn't a deciding factor for filmmaking at all in my opinion, it can be for photography, but it doesn't have to be. It depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting portraits in the studio, it really doesn't matter. If you're shooting wildlife or if you're shooting landscape, I also don't think that this is a deciding factor. But if you're shooting weddings, I think you better have 2 card slots, because this is a lot of responsibility and you don't want to rely on only one card, because if that card fails, then all of your pictures are gone. So you better have the option to shoot pictures on both card slots at the same time. Another minor difference between the two cameras is the screens. The original EOS R has a higher resolution screen on the back, and it also features a small screen on top of the camera. Using both cameras, I don't think that the difference between the back screen is actually really seeable, so in most cases it really doesn't matter. And yes, it is nice to have that small screen on top of the camera, but some people like it, some people don't. So overall, again, I don't think that this is a deciding factor at all. So now let's give you my overall verdict. And I'm sure you can tell that I really do like the R6 and I prefer it in most situations over the original R. But that doesn't mean that you should just spend the $700 on the R6, because it really depends on what you shoot. If you're shooting sports and high-paced content, I would 100% recommend the R6, because it's so much faster in focusing as well as in frames per second, and that makes a huge difference. It's also better in low light, so overall the R6 is the clear winner here. If you're shooting weddings, I would also definitely go to the R6 for the 2 card slots alone and the low light capabilities, as well as the better autofocus. But if you're shooting portraits and landscape, the R is totally fine and is even maybe a little bit better with the higher megapixel count. So if you're shooting something that you can recreate, if you're shooting portraits and you're having setup shoots, then the R is totally fine and there's no need to spend the extra $700. So now I'm curious, what is it that you're shooting? Let me know down in the comments below. Are you a jack of all trades and you're shooting a little bit of everything, or you're only shooting portraits and never dabble in sports photography? You're only shooting wildlife, you never shoot any people. So what is it that you're shooting and why would you go for one camera or the other? I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more, and I hope to see you on the next one.